Welcome back. Today I'm going to go over the gear that I use to make my feature length documentary, Brave in the Attempt. If you haven't seen it, that's fine. It's up here. I'll link it up here and in the description. Let's go. I set out to make a documentary on my Special Olympics floor hockey team when we went to the national games. I was planning on it being just a fairly short sort of story documentary, but it actually ended up taking place over months. I ended up just deciding that it was going to be a full feature length documentary. In that regard, I was kind of learning on the fly, trying to figure stuff out, and essentially just pretty much using the gear that I had. The camera gear, I guess. The cameras that I used for this documentary ended up using three main different cameras. So my A cam was my Sony A6100. This guy has been my camera for the better part now of 6 years. I think it's been about 6 years since I've had this camera. And I filmed a lot of my YouTube content on this particular camera. Everything was pretty much filmed in 4K 24. I did some slow-mo stuff, but the majority of it was the 4K 24. The microphone that was on there, again, most of the audio was recorded with the Rode Video Mic Go 2. Again, this has been on this camera for a very long time. It was upgraded from the Video Micro, just a small one. I found that this mic produces great audio, especially for the price that it is. That was the main camera that I used. So for the interview portions, I used a two-camera setup. For the first interview, which I'll overlay here, which was done with one of my athletes' bosses, the A camera was the Sony A6100. I don't have the second camera here, but I'll just overlay some footage. The second camera was a Canon SL2, and that was the B camera for that interview and the section where we were doing two camera setup at the it was the second camera that I used at the send-off party. So I had that one doing a close side view, and then I had my A6100 doing the front view there. Um, and then for the second interview um, that I did for the feature, the main camera was the Sony A6100, and then the B cam was my Sony A7. So I got this one a little bit later in the production phase of the documentary.
We met January of 2022, so we've known each other for about 2 years now. That's it. It feels like that's what I mean. Is I feel like I've known you longer than 2 years. I feel like our friendship, like maybe in a past life, if you believe in that, I do feel like James and I have always been connected in some way. If it's sports, if it's work, if it's other personal stuff, we've always had a connection. I feel.
Yeah.
So yeah, only 2 years.
2 years.
It feels like 20.
Yeah.
Yeah. It feels like
It sure seems like that.
it does.
Yeah, so again, this was the B cam to go along with the A cam on the interviews. For the handful of aerial shots, I used my DJI Mavic Mini. This is the first gen Mavic Mini. So it is not the 4K version. I've since upgraded to the DJI Mini 3, which is oodles better than this one. But again, for what I needed it for, it did the job. That's all the camera bodies that I used. As far as lenses go, on the camera bodies, I pretty much only used a few lenses. On the Sony A7, Pretty much the only lens I used was the Sony 50 millimeter 1.5, or sorry, the Sony 50 millimeter 1.8. It's pretty much the nifty 50 of the Sony cameras. Good image. It did the job exactly what I needed it to. On the Sony A6100, I pretty much use two different lenses for the most part. The odd time I would use this one. This is just the Sony APS-C 50 millimeter 1.8 lens. A great lens, super fast, takes great images. I didn't use this one too much because the majority of the time, this is the lens that was attached to the Sony A6100, and it's arguably one of my favorite lenses. It's so versatile and great image, super fast focusing. It's the Sony 18 to 105 f4. Again, this is just an APS-C lens. This is probably the lens that I use the most. If I don't have this particular lens on this camera that I'm filming on, this is the other lens that's on there. That's pretty much the only three lenses that I used for the entire shoot. The Canon SL2 had the the Canon EFS, no, the Canon EF 50 millimeter 1.8. Again, the nifty 50. Versatile lens, looks great. But that's the other lens that I used was the Canon 50 millimeter 1.1.8 nifty 50. It's a great lens, super cheap, no complaints. The other stuff that I used as far as audio goes, so I already touched on the microphone on the camera that I use. So again, the Rode Video Mic Go 2, great mic, highly recommend it. The other audio piece that I used for um, athletes when I was following them around and for the interview process is the the Rode Wireless Go 2. So I'd have these with the Joby lavalier. So I'd have the the subjects hooked up to the lav mics. I would just record on here because they do have the onboard recording. I really wish it was the Go 2 Pros, but beggars can't be choosers at this point. So I would hook those up to the athlete, do my little audio syncing, and then I would just use that. It was especially handy when I was doing the two camera interviews because I would just record the entire thing on here, get the scratch audio from the two cameras, and just sync it all up, and it would just make cutting between the two cameras so much easier. As far as the main equipment, honestly, that's all I used. I didn't really have any lights. The one interview with the one athlete at the beginning, that was all done with natural light. I really like how that one turned out. The other one with the athlete and his coworker, again, it was all just the light from the room. I wish I could have had a little bit more time to do some blocking and add in some other lights. Unfortunately, it was at their work, and I didn't have a ton of time to really get in there and set that up. So again, that's part of the lessons learned video that I'm gonna make later. As far as the camera settings went, both of these cameras, well, especially with so this is the only camera that I was able to shoot 4K in. The Sony A6100 shot 99% of the footage 4K. I would set it to 24 frames per second, or it's 23.92 whatever. The Sony A6100 set to 4K, it shoots 24p, so 24 frames per second. I shot it in the highest bit rate available. So on this particular camera, it's 100 megabits per second. And then, so the codec is the XAVC-S 4K. And then in this one, since it really doesn't have like picture profiles like S-Log3, I have sort of like a log-ish profile. Um, I will bring this up here. Menu settings, if you can see that there. I basically have it in sort of the standard profile, but I change like the saturation and the yeah, I changed some of the settings basically so it kind of gives a like a log image onto it. So it's the best I could do with this particular camera. Now the Sony A7 and the Canon SL2, they both shoot only in 1080, but they are both able to shoot at 24 frames per second. So that's what I did for both of those cameras. Again, I don't have the Canon SL2 handy with me. Thankfully, the menus on the two Sony cameras are very similar. So again, I put it to the standard and then have the like the saturation and the color contrast and that set to that log format. So that's what that was. So the image is pretty close. So the codec for this one is, so I'm not really sure what this one's specifically called, but the best one that I could get, the highest quality that I could get, was the 24p FX. So this one only shoots at like 24 megabits per second. So color wise, pushing it doesn't have as much latitude as the A6100 does, but um, I mean, you can hardly tell the difference. And the Canon SL2, again, same thing. Highest bit rate I could, which I think is around 30 to 50 megabits per second, and 24p. That was pretty much everything that I used for the documentary. Again, like, you really don't have any excuses to say that you don't have the right gear, or honestly, you need to make something with what you have. Again, it looks like I have a lot of stuff. I've had the Sony A6100 for at least 5 or 6 years. That Sony A7 was like $200. I also had the DJI already for a couple years, and I got that used, so it was already cheap. And the Canon SL2 is my daughter's camera. So again, if I really wanted to make this and I didn't have any of that equipment, honestly, I would still use my phone. I've done a podcast, 3 camera setup with strictly just iPhones, like with 3 iPhones set up. So there's really no excuse not to make something. If you have any questions about any of the gear, like if you want me to go into more detail about something specific, do let me know. Ask it down in the comments. I will go into probably one of the next few videos after this one. I'll go into sort of some of the things I learned from making this documentary and maybe some of the things that I would change. It's not a lot, but definitely there were things learned, and which is a good thing because if you don't do the thing, you're not going to be able to learn from your experience or any of the mistakes that you made. Because failing is good. Because if you don't fail, then you can't learn and you can't build on that. So, with that, I'm going to leave that here. Thanks for watching. My documentary is called Brave in the Attempt. It's about my Special Olympics floor hockey team that I coach, their journey to their first national games, and some of the things that they've had to go through to get there. So, I hope you enjoyed. Thanks for coming out. We'll see you in the next one. Ciao.